Hello, my New Testament introduction students. I wanted to make a quick video before you set out working on the Matthew assignment and then later the Luke assignment, and you've already done the Mark assignment. I wanted to just take a short little video to articulate a couple of fundamental things to know about the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are obviously Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, we did Mark first because that's generally assumed to be the earliest, and now we're doing Matthew and Luke. But I just wanted to make sure we drive home a couple of things. The first thing I want to verbally tell you about is has to do with that attachment I sent when I graded your Mark assignments having to do with the concept of the kingdom of God. This is a fundamental concept that you really need to understand if you're going to understand not just the Gospels, but pretty much anything in the New Testament, because it gets to the heart of what the first century Christian worldview was and how it came out of the first century Jewish worldview. Now, if you read that attachment that I sent you, the basic thing to realize is that for first century Jews, as they look back on their history, and hopefully you know enough about Old Testament history to get this, back in 587 was the Babylonian exile, when the Jews were taken into exile because they broke the covenant that they made with God at Mount Sinai. That's how they understood it. They thought they were dead as a nation, and for all practical purposes they were. About 70 years later, you had prophets arise, like we see in the second half of Isaiah, starting in chapter 40, that start prophesying that God is going to allow the Jews to come back to the Promised Land, and He's going to reestablish them and cleanse them and renew them and all that stuff. And they, under Cyrus the Great, they were allowed to come back to the Promised Land. When they were doing that, they're coming out of the Babylonian exile. When you read some of the Old Testament prophets, like Isaiah, they describe that event of coming out of the exile like a new Exodus. They're coming out of bondage back to the Promised Land. It's like the new Exodus. And with that, they had a whole bunch of expectations. They were expecting to be back in the land, which happened. They were expecting to have a new glorious temple. It turned out they built one that was okay, but not as great as Solomon's. They wanted to have an Israelite king, a Messiah figure, an anointed one. They never got one. They wanted to be free from foreign oppression. They were always under foreign oppression, and you saw that in the intertestamental time. And so by the time of Jesus' day, the Jewish worldview basically had this concept that they, even though they were back in the land, they really weren't fully restored yet. The ultimate exodus that they were hoping for hadn't really happened yet. And therefore, they viewed their current situation, living under Roman occupation in that case, they were living in what they would call the Old Age, which was ruled by Satan ultimately. And they knew that was happening because there was still sin in the world. There was still demon possession. We see this in the stories. There was spiritual dryness. The Spirit had not been poured out on God's people. They weren't their own nation yet. They didn't have a king. The Messiah hadn't come. All that stuff told the Jews that they were still living in the old age. And therefore, their messianic hope was they hoped that when God would send His Messiah, that He would then pour out His Spirit on His people, that the Messiah would defeat the foreign powers, that the Messiah would establish Israel as a top kingdom in the world, so to speak, and that would be accompanied with health instead of sickness, demon exorcism to get rid of the demonic oppression, and ultimately they believed it would have to have, in some way, have to do with the resurrection of the dead. Not just one person, but all the righteous Jews who had suffered in the past would be resurrected and partake of this glorious new kingdom, the new creation, and the new final exodus would be complete. That's what they were thinking. And so when you read the Gospels, Mark, now Matthew, and even Luke, when you hear terms like Messiah or Christ or King or Kingdom of God, you have to first read those terms from the perception of a first century Jew. And I've made that obvious in some of my comments on your Mark stuff. So that's really important to realize as you are going through the Gospels to try to interpret. And what you see, like we saw in Mark, as soon as Jesus shows up and starts proclaiming the kingdom of God, that term, kingdom of God, meant something to first century Jews that forced them to interpret things in a certain way. And what you see going on in the Gospels is that essentially, Jesus is saying he's the Messiah, but he's not the kind of Messiah that they're expecting. And so when you did the Mark assignment, and I had you look at some of those passages, the prologue part, the baptism of Jesus, the presentation of Jesus in the kingdom of God in Mark is spoken of, used in the language of creation and Exodus. In fact, anything in the Gospels assume that somehow there's a connection to the creation account and the Exodus account, because those are the two main ways they're trying to explain what the kingdom of God is. When Jesus brings the kingdom of God, announces the kingdom of God, it is portrayed as a new creation. It is portrayed as a new Exodus. And those are terms that the Jews would have been familiar with, but they were expecting that to happen in more of a geopolitical sense alone. And what you see going on is that Jesus' messiahship is not about fighting foreign oppressors, but fighting the ultimate enemy, Satan and the kingdom in the old age. And that has implications a lot throughout the Gospels. So that's why at his baptism you have all the creation imagery and the Exodus imagery. The Beelzebub controversy is also really important because if you look at it closely, that's the beginning of that big question. The scribes accuse him of having the power of Satan, Beelzebub, and Jesus says, "No, I'm not working for Satan. I'm not working for Satan's kingdom. In fact, that would be stupid because it would be ruining his own kingdom." Instead, what he's doing, he says he is binding the strong man, which in this case is obviously Satan. So Jesus is basically saying what he's doing with his exorcisms and his healings is he is binding the power of Satan, tying Satan up so that the kingdom of God could make its way into this into the old age. Now, that gets to the heart of what the Beelzebub controversy is. Now, we can't go through in detail everything in Mark, but you'll see this as you see in Matthew 2. One of the interesting things is once you understand that, you read other stories in Mark and Matthew, and you kind of see that theme coming out. And let me just point out one. I think I mentioned it in some of the discussions. The Beelzebub controversy, it says that he's binding the strong man. A couple of chapters later, after he gets in the boat and they go over the sea, and they have a Jonah-like episode where they're at sea, there's a storm, the disciples wake him up, and unlike Jonah, who says, "Throw me into the sea because I'm running away from God," shockingly, Jesus tells the sea and the storm to shut up, be quiet, and it obeys. Right there's an indication that Jesus isn't just a prophet, he's doing things that only God can do. Okay, so that's one of the things that the disciples are trying to figure out. So in that story, the calming of the sea, at the end of that episode, the disciples are saying, "Who is this guy?" They don't clearly see yet. Right after that, they go to what it would be Gentile territory. If you know the geography, that's where they're going. And they encounter a demon-possessed man who lives among the tombs. And the description is really interesting because we're told that many times people there had tried to tie him up, but he would always break through his bonds. And it specifically says no one was able to bind him. And if you're reading Mark as a literary whole, that should ring a bell. And you're like, Beelzebub controversy. Jesus is binding the strong man. This demon-possessed man, the demons in the band are going to they're in for it. All right? And so as the story goes, as that episode goes, when Jesus asks him what his name is, the demons in the man says, "My name is Legion because we are many." Now again, put it into the first century context. If you're a Jew in the first century and you hear the word legion, you're going to be thinking about Roman legions. Those are your oppressors. But in this story of Jesus casting the demons out of the man of the tombs, it's becoming clear that Jesus is fighting not against Roman legions, but against satanic legions. That's where the real battle is in this battle for the kingdom of God. And so basically what he does there is he casts the demons out into the swine, and the swine go over the cliff into the sea. Now obviously, why swine? Because that's how Gentiles were perceived, unclean. Why the sea? Because the sea was often it was literally the Sea of Galilee, but metaphorically it had those implications of the sea of chaos and darkness and death and hell and Sheol. And so basically what Jesus is doing in that episode is sending the demons back to hell, so to speak, because his kingdom is coming, not just to Jewish territory, but in this case to Gentiles as well. And that's one of the things you see unfold in the Gospel of Mark. And then finally, I want to say a couple words about the other thing you read, the juxtaposition of Herod and Jesus. Those two scenes have to go together, because as you now see, the picture of Herod, the kings of Israel were called shepherds of Israel. So the picture you get of Herod at his birthday with all his political leaders coming for his birthday bash, and him foolishly promising his stepdaughter up to half his kingdom, and she asking for John the Baptist's head. John was a prophet. So the picture you get of Herod is he's a bad king of Israel. He's a bad shepherd of God's flock. In fact, he slaughters prophets. He slaughters members of God's flock just for his own birthday bash. Okay? That's the significance of bringing the head on the platter. It's not that they literally eat the head, but the image is of slaughtering the flock and bringing it in as a dish. And that's what Herod does. And then by contrast, you have Jesus, who is taking his disciples out to the wilderness, which again is a Exodus image, and he's feeding his people in the wilderness, kind of like God feeding the Israelites in the wilderness with the manna. And therefore, it's a significance that it says that he sees them as sheep without a shepherd. Why? Because Herod is their king, and he ain't no shepherd. That's the idea. And so when you read the feeding of the 5,000, you read it in light of the Herod story, and there's more meaning to it than just, gee, Jesus did a cool miracle. There's a theological statement being made. Now, one other thing that you didn't read. A little while later in Mark, Jesus goes over to Gentile territory again, and this time he feeds 4,000. It's significant that it's in Gentile territory. What does that tell you? The kingdom of God that Jesus is bringing isn't just coming to the Jews, it's coming to the Gentiles. And that is why it's significant to notice the number of baskets that are picked up. In Jewish territory, with the feeding of the 5,000, they pick up 12 baskets full of leftovers. Why 12? Symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel. The kingdom of God comes to Israel. But in Gentile territory, they pick up 7 baskets of leftovers. Why 7? Because 7 throughout the Bible is like God's number. It's the number of completion, the 7 days of the week. And so therefore, the overall theological push of this larger section in Mark, specifically these 2 feedings, is that the kingdom of God, Jesus, the good shepherd king, Messiah, is bringing the kingdom to the Jews, but as well, there's going to be a full number of Gentiles who come in, and together that will make up the true people of God. That's what Mark is kind of pushing in the way he lays it out. Now, I wanted to go over that a little bit simply because you want to get rid of the habit of trying to read parts of the gospel in decontextualized bits. Because when you do that, you read this part and your first question is like, what does it mean for me? And you come up with some kind of nice little moralistic lesson, which is fine. But if you're going to understand the Gospels in their own right, you have to understand them against that first century history. That's why we spent time looking at some of that history. Read it through that lens, but also read Mark as a whole literary unit. See how one episode relates to an episode a few chapters later. See the web and the connections that each gospel writer is making. Now, as you go through Matthew, now again, you're going to read a few specific parts of Matthew that we'll discuss later. But also, if you have more time, look back and see how Matthew expands on Mark's stuff and says a few more things. It's really interesting. Now again, it's a New Testament intro class. We can't go into detail. But with everything, I want you at least to take time to read a few snippets of each biblical book so you get a flavor for what they're doing, and hopefully that'll inspire you to read more on your own and research more on your own, and who knows, maybe even take more classes from me later on. All right, I just wanted to do that, so enjoy doing your Matthew stuff as well as Luke. I'll say right now with Luke, what you're going to see is Matthew's audience is really Jewish, so he really brings out Old Testament stuff because they would recognize it. When you read Luke, his audience is Gentile. They're not well-versed in Jewish scriptures. So Luke kind of takes out a lot of that out because they wouldn't have understood it. And so you see the differences between these three Gospels. Okay, anyway, enjoy your work. I've been enjoying going through it, and we will keep going throughout the semester. Bye.